Hey everybody, today we are debating God's existence and we're starting right now. Hey everybody, thrilled to have you here. This is a big one, ladies and gentlemen. This is, I think, one of the more interesting, I'll tell a really interesting story at the start that ties it all together. But it's exciting because we have two intellectual heavy hitters. These guys are very sharp, they're very well read. They both are kind of leaders in the online community. Jonathan Mcclatchy founded the Apologetics Academy, and we'll give him a sec to share about his organization, and then we'll also give JF a chance to share about his channel. As we welcome both of them, we say thanks for coming by, and also want to let you know, if this is your first time here, consider hitting that subscribe button. We are trying to build an eclectic community of people from different worlds, different beliefs. We are happy to have scholars, like we have 2 PhDs on today, and we're also happy to have average Joes just debating the issues. We are thrilled to have everybody kind of have a chance to make their case in the public arena. So with that, I want to introduce our speakers. I want to let you know both Jonathan Mcclatchy and JF have their links in the description. So if you're listening, you're like, I like that, you can find more in those links in the description right now. So Jonathan Mcclatchy, I'll give him a quick chance to share first just what he's up to at his channel or organization, Apologetics Academy, in a couple of sentences, and then we'll switch it over to JF to hear what he has been up to as well. And so Jonathan Mcclatchy, thanks for coming by, if you'd like to share.
Well, thanks so much. Hello, everyone. Great to be here with you to discuss this very interesting topic. My background is in the natural sciences, the life sciences more specifically. I did my bachelor's degree in forensic biology at Strathclyde University in Scotland. Subsequently did a master's degree in evolutionary biology at Glasgow University. I also had a master's in molecular biology from Newcastle University, and I'm very close to completing my PhD studies as well in biology. My passion and heartbeat in life is to promote an intelligent, rational, reflective, and evidence-based Christian faith. And I've done various debates. This is my 27th moderated debate. I've debated atheists, Muslims, and people of other persuasions as well. And as we just heard, I founded the Apologetics Academy, which you can find my website at apologetics-academy.org. And basically, I run online interactive webinars with some of the top leading scholars from all ends of the theological and philosophical spectrum, who give us presentations and then field Q&A from the floor. And so that's just a snippet of what I do.
You bet. Thanks so much again for being here, Jonathan. And JF, first time here. We really thank you for coming on. Glad to have you. If you want to share what you've been up to at your channel, we're glad to hear it.
Absolutely. Well, I've been hosting a show called The Public Space. You can see it on JFG live streams. And it's a show at 7 p.m. Eastern Time every night. We talk about the news, philosophy, science, politics. And yeah, so I've been a biologist forever. I've been interested in life and the emergence of life since I'm very young. I then did a biological science BSc. I moved on to a PhD in neuroscience. I've then done research on monkeys as a postdoc at Duke University. And I've been doing some clinical research on genetics. And more recently, I've been releasing this book, The Revolutionary Phenotype, in which I extend some of the theories of Richard Dawkins toward questions that were left unaddressed, such as the emergence of life, the evolution of the genetic code, and the evolution of sexual reproduction, which I would say were the three big mysteries of biology before the book. And I consider that now biology is complete, that I have a satisfying answer for these very special questions.
You got it. Well, we're glad to have you here, JF. And with that, we don't want to waste any time. I'm going to bring up and share about the format in just a second. We just want to let everybody know about a couple of quick things we usually like to plug. So the first is, we've talked about it before, and we want to just keep giving them attention. It's Be the Match, which is a bone marrow donor registry. And the reason we want to talk about them is because you can actually save a life by partnering with Be the Match, as they will cover all of the medical costs. If you connect with them and you basically request them to send cotton swabs to your house, which is for free, they will pay for all the medical costs if they find a match. And that's somebody who, let's say, has leukemia or cancer of the blood. Basically, you would be able to give life in a way, as you could potentially save somebody who is suffering from a debilitating illness. So, want to quick give an update as well regarding the great debate community led by Steve McRae. Just want to plug them, as Steve has said, hey, we're running a lot of debates as well, and I'm not only going to plug them, but mention that I'll be there tonight. So forgive me for plugging myself. I will be there tonight. It'll be a lot of fun, and I hope you guys, if you enjoy debates, we want to let you know where these debates are happening, even if they're not here. Like, we want you guys to kind of be able to make that choice for yourself. And last but not least, with that, I just want to quick mention an interesting story, because this channel, actually, I have to give credit to the fact that JF, your channel originally with Andy Worski was partially the inspiration for this channel, Modern Day Debate. I hadn't discovered it yet. It was a friend who had told me about it, and he's like describing it, and I haven't found it yet. Well, now I've obviously found it, and it's since passed. But the point is, it's an interesting story that is JF, in a way, you partially are responsible, or like inspiration for this channel. So it's an interesting story, as JF has been in the debate world online for a long time. So pretty
very nice. So you are a child of the blood sports.
Yeah, I appreciate. I do appreciate debates. That's for sure. Like at this channel, we like to have different sides have a chance, and sometimes I get grilled, and people are like, "Why do you have these creationists on, or why do you have, this on or this on?" And I'm like, if you're really that skeptical of it, like if you really think it's or flat Earth, we've done flat Earth before, and like if you really think it's that bad, don't you think that they'll get beat? Like I don't know. I don't see why I'm so bad for hosting it. But anyway, well, back to the actual debate. So thanks for being here, everybody, and again, want to let you know that you can check out these other channels. So I'm going to pull up Jonathan Mcclatchy's PowerPoint, as he is going to start the debate. And so for the format, want to let you know that we have 20-minute openings, 10-minute rebuttals, 6-minute cross-exams, 5-minute closings, and 20-minute Q&A. So it's going to be an interactive one with cross-exams, my favorite part, and then, as mentioned, if you are in the audience and you have a question, it'll make it a little bit easier for me. Feel free to submit your question into the live chat, and if you put @ModernDayDebate at the start, that'll make it just a little bit easier for me to see, and then I will fish all those questions out, and we will read through as many as we can. And last but not least, really quick, super chats, if you want to make a quick comment to one of the debaters, we will read that comment, to which they would get a chance to respond to it, and then also we would, all the super chats just automatically go to the top of the list. So, thanks for your patience. Jonathan Mcclatchy, the clock is set for you, and so I will start the clock on your first word as we transition into your opening statement. Thanks for being here, Jonathan. Oh, let's see. Would you happen to be on mute, Jonathan?
Sorry about that.
Oh, that's right.
Right. Well, thanks so much for your attention, for your attendance here. Thanks to JF for participating in this debate, and to Jim for hosting this debate on this most interesting discussion that has been a topic on many, many people's minds for centuries, even millennia. So without further ado, let me just crack on. I'm going to be presenting this evening the moral arena evidence for theism. Let me just get into what that exactly is, what that entails. So let me just start by defining a moral arena. Well, a moral arena is a community of persons in circumstances where they can engage in what we often call moral decision-making, interacting and molding their character in what we call morally significant ways. And I'm going to argue over the course of the next 19 minutes that the moral arena is very, very powerful evidence for theism over atheism. Let me just introduce to you the Behe's theorem, which is a tool which we can use to structure how we reason through such issues. And basically, it states that the posterior probability of a proposition being true is equal to the prior probability expresses a ratio of the prior probability given the hypothesis versus given the antithesis, multiplied by the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis against the probability of the evidence given the antithesis. And so Bayes' theorem is a tool to structure our thinking as we reason through such issues. And so I'm going to be arguing using Bayes' theorem to argue that the posterior odds of the existence of God are very, very high, even given the most absurdly generous of assumptions. So, as I mentioned, on the left-hand side is highlighted with the red square. We see the prior probability, and that's very important to start assessing. What's the prior probability that God exists? And the prior probability relates to what is the probability that the hypothesis is true, given just the background information before you consider the new evidence that is on the table. And there's a number of things that we might take into account. We might take into account, for example, the problem of evil. There's so much evil and suffering in the world, and yes, that's a very difficult problem. It's one of the strongest lines of evidence against theism. So let's just set the prior probability of the existence of God as something like 10 to the minus 20. Let's just say it's a very, very low prior probability of God existing, 10 to the minus 20, which I think is a very, very generous assumption. So let's then move on to discuss how strong the moral arena, how strong a piece of evidence the moral arena is for theism. Well, how do we define evidence? Well, I would define it as a Bayesian as that evidence for your hypothesis H, evidence E is evidence for your hypothesis H if and only if the probability of E is greater given H than given non-H. Or in other words, the probability of the moral arena given theism is greater than the probability of the moral arena given atheism. To give you an illustration, if you're having difficulty understanding this, in a court scene, imagine that the fingerprints of the accused are found on the murder weapon. And so that it becomes evidence for the guilt hypothesis over the hypothesis of innocence. It doesn't prove the guilt hypothesis, but it's strong evidence for it because the probability of the fingerprints of the accused being on the murder weapon are so much higher given the hypothesis of guilt relative to innocence. So then there's two things we need to assess. What's the probability of the moral arena existing on theism, and what is the probability of the moral arena existing on atheism? Well, let's start with the probability of a moral arena on theism. I think that on the hypothesis of theism, a moral arena, such as I defined, is something that God plausibly would create or bring about. So what is the prior probability? What is the probability of a moral arena existing on theism? I'm just going to be generous and assume that the probability of a moral arena on theism is somewhere in the range of 1 to 100%. Let's just say it's 1% chance on theism that God would create a moral arena. I think that's a generous assumption. What then, though, is the probability of the moral arena on atheism? So I've set the probability of the moral arena on theism at 1%, but it's not going to be something absurdly low. It's not going to be a ridiculously low percentage. It's going to be, I think, at least 1% chance on theism of God creating something like a moral arena. So then what's the probability of this moral arena existing on atheism? We could just guess, or we could try to get a better handle on this problem by breaking it down into smaller bite-sized components. So what sort of things would you need in order to get or to bring about, to actualize a moral arena? Well, you need a universe governed by physical laws such as gravity to begin with. The probability, though, of a universe coming into being from nothing, ex nihilo, on the hypothesis of atheism. Well, I'm just going to be generous and assume that the probability on atheism is something like 0.1%. I think it's far lower than that, but just for the sake of argument, we'll say it's 0.1% chance on atheism of a universe coming into being from nothing, governed by physical laws, etc. But you don't just need any old universe governed by physical laws. You also need a life-permitting universe. That is, a universe which is conducive to complex sentient life forms, or even any form of life for that matter. So what sort of evidence bears on the probability of getting a life-permitting universe on atheism? Well, I'm sure that my opponent this evening is very acquainted with the fine-tuning argument, which is to say that our universe appears to be highly fine-tuned for life of any form to exist anywhere at any time in our universe. In fact, as Brumfield here confesses in this article that you see on the screen, and I'm quoting, if you believe the equations of the world's leading cosmologists, the probability that the universe would turn out this way, life permitting, by chance are infinitesimal. Barnes, who's an astrophysicist at the University of Sydney in Australia, recently published a review of the scientific literature and reviewing more than 200 papers. It's the most extensive review article in the scientific literature I'm aware of on this topic. And he argues that he states that he can only think of, quote, a handful of physicists that oppose this conclusion, and yet piles and piles that support it. In fact, he lists some of the widely recognized constants that require fine-tuning for life. For example, the cosmological constant is thought to be finely tuned to 1 part in 10 raised to the 120th power. That's the most usual estimate that's given. And if you get it wrong, the universe either expands so rapidly that you only ever get the 2 lightest elements, or it collapses within picoseconds of the Big Bang. And notice, in such circumstances, no life of any kind could evolve. In fact, Roger Penrose at the University of Oxford has estimated the fine-tuning of the initial low entropy conditions of our universe. And it turns out that nearly all arrangements of particles in the early universe would have resulted in a lifeless universe of black holes. Any inconsistencies in the particle arrangements would be acted on by gravity to grow in size. A positive feedback results, since the clumps of particles have an even greater gravitational force on nearby particles. Penrose's analysis shows that in the incredibly dense early universe, most arrangements of particles would have resulted basically in nothing but black holes, and life certainly cannot exist in such a universe. In fact, he sets the probability of the initial low entropy conditions of our universe as 1 in 10 raised to the 10 raised to the 123rd power. So that's on the denominator 1 with 10 to the 123 zeros after it. That's more zeros after the 1 on the denominator than subatomic particles in the known universe. And so that's an incredible level of fine-tuning. What other constants might require fine-tuning? Well, we have, as I mentioned, the cosmological constant. We also have the expansion rate of the universe, which is finely tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 55th power, or the ratio of electrons to protons, which is thought to be finely tuned to 1 part in 10 raised to the 37th power. If it's larger or smaller, chemical bonding would be insufficient for life chemistry. We have the ratio of the electromagnetic force to gravity, which is thought to be 1 in 10 raised to the 40th power. We have the energy density of the universe, thought to be finely tuned to 1 in 10 to the 55th power. If it was larger, gravity would have quickly gravity would quickly have slowed the expansion and then caused the universe to collapse too quickly for life to form. And if it was smaller, the universe would have expanded so quickly that you would never get the formation of galaxies, stars, or planets. But I'm just going to be generous and assume that we've wildly overestimated the improbability of attaining those constants by chance. And I'm going to just say, for the purpose of argument, that the probability of getting a life-permitting universe, given atheism and a universe at all, is 0.1%. I don't think that my opponent can argue with that. I'm being absurdly generous. I'm saying the probability of a universe that's finely tuned for life on atheism is 0.1%. What about the origins of life? I was excited to hear my opponent has actually written on this topic, so I'm looking forward to engaging on that. Well, you need, as you mentioned, the genetic code, which is the mapping of the codons, these triplets of ribonucleotides that code for amino acids, to the amino acids for which they code. And that's a coding system which I think is prohibitively improbable to evolve on a naturalistic origins of life scenario. We also have to get the origins of the first proteins. It's not just enough to get the amino acids. You have to sequence them in such a way that they collapse into the respective three-dimensional structure. And the sequential arrangement of the amino acid subunits determines protein structure and how it will perform its job, either in a biochemical pathway, perhaps, or in a molecular machine or something like that in the cell. Now, a question that we can ask is the prevalence of functional folds in combinatorial sequence. Many different sorts of amino acids that we use in cellular proteins. That means that for a molecular length protein of, say, 150 amino acids, there are 20 raised to the power of 150 possible combinations of those amino acids. So then, how prevalent are functional protein folds in combinatorial space? That's a question that we can ask. And I think that Darwinism and design make competing predictions on this. I think Darwinism predicts a relative abundance of stable and functional protein folds within that space, whereas design would predict an astronomical rarity, such that you would not be able to, by a blind search, hop from one island of function to another, or locate those functions by a blind random search. And it turns out there's various studies on this we can discuss. This is a classic paper, a very well-known paper that was published in the Journal of Molecular Biology, 2004, by Dr. Douglas Axe, where he took an enzyme complex and a particular domain from beta-lactamase, which is an enzyme that confers antibiotic resistance in certain bacteria. And he estimated that the ratio of stable and functional protein folds in that sequence space is 1 in 10 raised to the 74th power. So that's an astronomical rarity of protein folds. And so just getting one short protein by chance seems to be prohibitively improbable. And there's the conclusion from this paper right there. So this presents us with a probabilistic resource problem. There are approximately 10 to the 80 elementary particles in the known universe. And since the Big Bang, roughly 10 to the 16 seconds have elapsed. The time it takes light to traverse the smallest distance is 10 to the minus 43 seconds, known as the Planck length, or the Planck time. By multiplying together the three relevant factors, we can determine that the maximum number of events that could have taken place in the observable universe since its origin is 10 to the 139th power. And so that sets a universal probability bound of anything that's beyond that in terms of its probabilistic, the improbability of it. It suggests that we can rule out the chance hypothesis safely. This presents us with a needle in a haystack problem. Locating the functional folds is like finding a tiny, tiny needle in an enormous haystack and having a very, very limited time to search. But the problem gets worse when we're dealing with the origins of molecular machines in the cell. Charles Darwin, and that my opponent will be very familiar with this quote from The Origin of Species, published in 1859. He put forward a prediction by which you could test or falsify his theory. He said if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And it turns out that we actually have many such systems in biology. Michael Behe, in 1996, he's a biochemist at Lehigh University, published a book called Darwin's Black Box, A Biochemical Challenge to Evolution, in which he sought to take up Darwin's challenge. And he coined a term to express what Darwin was getting at here, and that is the term irreducible complexity. He says, by irreducible complex, I mean a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of these parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. These are just some of the systems in the cell which I would take to be irreducibly complex. We have the bacterial flagellar system. We have mitosis, which is my own area of expertise. We have DNA replication machinery. We have the bacterial divisome, etc. These are all systems which require multiple subfunctions in order to perform their job in the cell. Remove one or multiple of those subfunctions, and the system ceases to perform its job. And so how would you build up a system like that? By chance and necessity, natural selection acting on random genetic variation. But I'm just going to set the probability of the origins of life on atheism at 0.1%, which I think is an absurdly generous probability. I'm going to set the probability of molecular machines on atheism, given all these things that we've just discussed, at 0.1%. which I think is an absurdly generous assumption. I don't think my opponent can argue with those numbers because I'm being so absurdly generous. What about the origins of multicellularity? I don't have just time to discuss some of the probabilistic challenges to acquire multicellularity. We can discuss it later if need be. But I'm just going to set the probability again at 0.1% on atheism. Origins of animal body plants. Again, really a serious challenge, I think, to Darwinism. Do you get from a single cell or a zygote, fertilized egg, to your fully viable form? This is C. elegans, a well-known model organism in biology that we see, and it's obviously developed from this fertilized egg and through a cell differentiation and specification. Paul Nelson, who's a philosopher of biology, coined this term ontogenetic depth, which refers to the distance for any animal between a single-celled state and the adult capable of reproduction. Notice that if you're able to get halfway across that chasm between the zygote and the adult capable of reproduction, you don't have a live organism, you have a dead organism. You have to get all the way across that distance in order to have a viable organism. That's a sort of process that requires foresight and is not accessible, I think, to chance and necessity. Nonetheless, I'm going to be very generous, I think, and argue that the probability of getting animal body plans on atheism is 0.1%. What though about the origins of consciousness in which is required for sentient agents such as ourselves? Notice that nothing is known in physics that would allow someone to look at the brain and conclude, hey, there's someone in there. This thing has first-person experiences. So you can't predict consciousness by way of physics and seeing the brain. Now you might think, well, only brains with subjective experiences would avoid pain and so forth. And so we can predict that consciousness would evolve because it's adaptive. But this is also wrong, I think. Only people who believe in souls think the mind can affect the brain like that. Almost all atheists say your body would just do what it does even if no consciousness existed, because it's a physically closed machine. All your neurons would fire just the same without you and move your body the same way. Evolutionary history would be identical without subjective experience. I'm just going to be charitable and assume that the probability of getting the moral arena on, getting the consciousness on atheism is 0.1%. And then you might get a moral arena where you have the origins of objective moral norms and duties in the world. And so here we see the various factors that I considered. So you have the universe governed by physical laws such as gravity, life-permitting universe that's finely tuned, the origins of life, origins of molecular machines, multicellularity, animal body plans, the origins of consciousness, and the origins of ethical norms. And I'm just going to assume very charitably, very generously, those are the only things you need for a moral arena, which I think is absurdly generous as well, and that each of these has a 0.1% chance of coming about given the hypothesis of atheism. By multiplying together the relevant factors, we arrive at the probability, the strength of the evidence. We arrive at the probability on atheism, which can be thought of as 1 times 10 to the minus 24th power, which is an absurdly low probability on atheism. And you'll notice that, if we remember back at the start, I said that the probability of a moral arena on theism was 1%, or 0.01. 0.01 is much greater than 1 times 10 to the minus 24th power. And so even given the most absurdly, outrageously generous of assumptions, the existence of the moral arena is overwhelming evidence for theism over atheism. But what about the prior probability of God? Remember I said we had to factor that in as well. Well, remember I said that the prior probability of God, I said an absurdly generous level of 10 to the minus 20. The weight of this evidence that we've considered today is sufficient to overcome a prior probability of 10 to the minus 20 and still obtain posterior odds of 0.9999 for the existence of God. And so that brings me to my conclusion that the evidence is overwhelmingly strong in favor of theism and sufficient to overcome a very low prior probability of God's existing. And so then we should affirm the motion that God does indeed exist. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for your opening statement. We will switch back into the dialogue boxes, and I'm going to reset the clock for 20 minutes for JF's opening statement. And JF, one thing I forgot to mention. Originally when I ran the debate by JF, I said this would be a debate that whether or not there is strong evidence for theism. So Jonathan has a heavy burden, of which I think I ran that by Jonathan, and he said, yeah, I'm willing to go for it. And so want to let you know the burden is a heavy one. And so we're excited to have you guys here and be as tough on the debaters as you want. As long as be tough on their arguments, but please don't give us super chats that, like, Kent Hovind took a beating one time, and it was like, man, you guys... Anyway, all right, thanks for being here. JF, the floor is yours. I will start the clock on your first word.
All right, it's interesting as an argument, and I'm excited to be telling my view about all of this. There are lots of levels in which what Jonathan is doing is wrong here, but I'll start with a general statement. The scientific understanding of life provides a sufficient explanation for how life came to be what it is, for the observed diversity of the genes that we have, for the relatedness of different creatures, for the similarities that we see between genes. And so, I mean, I'm not an ultimate atheist in the sense of totally denying the possibility, the intellectual possibility that some creator exists above the universe. I'm more of an agnostic atheist in the sense that I don't see any evidence that compels me to believe in God, and therefore it's not a belief I will create, just like I will not believe in purple ponies existing at every point of the universe, simply because I don't have evidence that there are purple ponies everywhere. So it's more in that way that I deny the existence of God. It's that among all of the possible things, God is one, and the way it is presented to us by religion, whether it be Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, is not a form in which it is very likely, and alternative explanations are sufficient to explain the observable world. Now let's dig into this moral arena argument specifically, which I've never been familiarized with that form, but if you want to measure how ridiculous it is to use the moral argument, you just have to change moral arena for something else that we observe in the living world. Suppose that I was to see a squirrel scratching his testicles with his own claws. I could make the squirrel scratching testicles argument in the same format that Jonathan just did to the moral arena. Well, what's the likelihood that we have a universe with squirrels? Well, it does require the universe. It does require body plans. It does require the emergence of life. It does require complex proteins. And so you could take any observation, and essentially all of the arguments that Jonathan just listed would be required, perhaps except consciousness, because you could have a squirrel scratching its testicles without having consciousness, but we'll get to consciousness later. But that just gives you an idea that something is wrong with this argument. And the first thing I will point to in terms of the wrongness is this idea that we develop certain beliefs out of probabilistic thinking. Personally, I don't. I can have predictions. I can have limited situations in my life where I have limited knowledge on the world, and therefore I will resort to probabilistic thinking. But we're not in a civil court. We're not with a judge that has to say, all right, I believe more you than you. This is not how scientists proceed, and this is not how I develop, especially not important metaphysical perceptions of the universe. It is unsatisfying to say, well, I calculated some things here, and it's more likely. I'm not satisfied by the more likely, especially because, first, I don't believe that the percentages that were expressed by Jonathan are satisfying. But even beyond that, the very idea that we should create things that exist outside of our observable universe, that have huge control, that have omniscience, omnipotent action on the universe, all of this based on probabilistic calculations for which these numbers have not been properly defended, is absolutely ridiculous and can lead you really to any conclusion. Just change the word God for other entities, and you will see that this argument doesn't hold. But I'll go point by point to say why it doesn't hold. So the first thing is, looking at life, there is no sign of consciousness in the making of life. The way we see genes evolve, and genes having a different function in different organisms, and the way we see similar sequences of DNA in our own cells, as we see in squirrels, as we see in lions, and as we see down to bacteria and even viruses. This similarity between all life forms, and the fact that life forms that are most different between one another are also most genetically different. It shows that there is something that comes from the genes and that determines what life forms look like in terms of their phenotype. And in terms of explaining how do we get from a bacteria to a human or a lion, well, we have time and we have mutations, but another aspect that doesn't seem to have been included in the calculations of Jonathan is we have natural selection. And natural selection has an amplifying effect on the probabilities in the search space. So one of the arguments of Jonathan was the search space of all possible proteins is impossible to go through. It's like finding a needle in a haystack, and that is absolutely correct. If you take the possible complexity of chains of protein, chains of RNA, chains of DNA, there is not a computer in the world that will reach this conclusion within any sort of finite or reasonable amount of times. He's correct, but he's wrong where he assumes that evolution or biological evolution is a random search. It is not a random search. It is a random search that is supplemented with a very critical element, natural selection, which is, if you were to take the needle in an haystack metaphor, it would mean that you're not just searching for a needle in a haystack. That needle is attached to a thread. And if you find the thread, you find your path toward the needle. That is what life forms are doing when they have mutations and they get selected for these mutations. They are essentially not exploring the whole space of possibility. They're exploring what works, and they build upon what works, and there is some sort of random search around what works, but a life form never really makes big jumps that are unjustifiable in terms of the survival of the intermediary forms. Let's start with the fine-tuning argument and the universe itself. I think that the understanding of Bayesian probability of Jonathan is correct in the way he expressed it, but he forgot one important thing. You cannot apply Bayesian thinking without knowing probabilities, and you cannot know probability if you don't have an overlook over the space of possibility from which you ended up in the current situation. I will give you a metaphor for this. Suppose that you're in a casino and you look at the VIP roulette for the whole day, and you write on a piece of paper the particular numbers that are coming out every time the croupier throws the little sphere. At the end of the day, you're going to come to me and say, Jeff, look at the sequence of numbers that has happened today at the casino. That sequence of number is extremely unlikely. And my answer to you it will be, well, it's an unlikely sequence of number starting in the morning when you didn't know what was going to happen. But as far as what has happened, it is the sequence of numbers that has happened. And even if it is extremely unlikely, it is what the current world is. You live in the universe where this particular sequence of number has occurred. Now, you can imagine other worlds in which other sequences of casino numbers would have been pulled, but you cannot say that your day is extremely unlikely. Of course, the little ball had to fall into one of the slots. Of course, one of the number had to be picked at every time. And the sequence of number you attain at the end of the day, although it is unlikely in terms of theory in your brain about what could have happened, it is extremely likely that there had to be a sequence of numbers, and that these numbers would be between 0 and 36. You could have a frame within which essentially the sequence of number itself may be unlikely, but the event that there is a particular sequence of number that has occurred is absolutely certain. Then let's talk about the origins of the first protein, and I wrote the book about it, so I highly recommend to everyone in the audience to read the book. It actually provides the answer as to how we get into the DNA-based genetic code from smaller and from more simple systems. And it turns out that the Revolutionary Phenotype reveals that all you really need to get natural selection is replication, as was said by Richard Dawkins, replication with some sort of mutational process. So an imperfect process of replication, and the little errors are being favored as long as these errors they help further reproduction. Now, there is still a very special event that occurs when a replicator dedicates its replication task to another molecule. And this has happened at least 2 or 3 times, depending on how we count them. It has happened 2 or 3 times in our ancestry, where an original replicator, protein replicators, was creating copies of itself in some way, perhaps using RNA molecules as enzymes to help itself do it. And eventually the RNA molecules took over the job of self-replication, and eventually DNA took over the job of self-replication. And now we're in a life form where DNA has kind of won the status of self-replication, but the rest of the genetic code has been established precisely through this history where the new self-replicator is created by an original replicator. And so all you really have to do to invoke to have a protein self-replicator, well, first we've created some in the lab, so we know it exists. And really all that matters to get there is you need to have some form of natural selection occurring to your early replicators, and whatever sequence of amino acids that ends up working will create millions and billions of descendants. And from these descendants, you have a space of possibility that is much less probable to find solutions from an evolutionary standpoint. So that's where I disagree with the 0.1%. I disagree with the fine-tuning universe argument, because we are in that universe and you cannot invoke probabilities as long as you don't know how many universes are there, how many, what are the parameters that these fine-tuned values, what are the ranges in which they can vary. All of these questions lead me to question the 0.1% argument for the universe, and for the reasons stated for proteins also. Now let's talk about I've already covered the impossibility to explore through random search. Again, biological evolution is not random search. Mutations are random search, but when they are amplified through a process of natural selection, you have wild variations of probabilities, which again leads me to question the 0.1% chance here. Now let's talk about, and the same argument goes for what he called the probabilistic resources problem, that there would not be enough time or space in the universe to locate the tiny needle in a haystack. Well, natural selection gives you more than a tiny needle. It gives you a tiny needle that has a line of ancestry. You can see it as a little filament attached to the needle, finding your way through the space of possibility. Then we have the irreducible complexity argument. This idea that the flagella of bacteria has irreducible complexity in the sense that its components are useless on their own. Now, the thing is, a modern component of a modern complex system could look useless to us in the current world, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't come from more primitive assembly elements. And in fact, I recommend for this the article Bacterial Flagella and Type 3 Secretion, Case Studies in the Evolution of Complexity by Pal and Goffner, where they look at the history of the genes that compose the little machines that Jonathan has shown. And these genes, they exist separately in various bacteria. And what most likely happened is they got together to form the flagella using both natural selection and descent, and also horizontal transfer. So genes that were in a bacteria that were not participating to the flagella at all can have been absorbed through viral transmission, or however you want to call it, through transfer of genes in some form from one bacteria to the other, eventually leading to the assembly of the flagella. I will also note that it's not true that the proteins constituting the flagella do not inherit from structures that were evolutionarily developed for other purposes than the flagella. You can see in the structure that he illustrated, there are channel-like structures. Well, channels existed before the flagella. Life had already found solutions to pierce holes in the membrane and to allow communication between the inside and the outside. And those elements did end up also being used in the case of the flagella. So I deny this argument from irreducible complexity, and arguments have been made on other structures that Jonathan did not mention, like the eye. I've seen forms of this argument applied to the complexity of the eye. Again, photoreception can evolve without being in a complex eye. Photoreception is useful the moment one cell tells you, oh, it's the day now, or oh, it's the night now. So a digital information gathering process is sufficient for certain life forms to survive. And then it just so happens that this process has been complexified through evolution from this very primitive state that we see in single-cell organisms to the very complex human eye that we benefit from, which has very high resolution. The problem of multicellular life is an interesting problem, and I have a chapter about it in my book, chapter 11. It's called Sex because I consider that sex and multicellular life are related to each other in some way. But the argument for multicellular life is very simple. It's multicellular bodies evolve in the same way ant colonies evolve. It is that there is first a reproductive entity. In the case of, let's do first the ant colony and see how it evolves. So you have a reproductive system where mothers create lots of babies. Each of these babies is somehow in the race to create their own babies eventually too. Now, you can have an accident at some point in evolution that renders some of the babies of the mother handicapped. And for some reason, they are unable to produce their own offspring. Now, at that moment in evolution, what you have is a pressure for the handicapped baby to still do whatever they can to help their mothers produce functional babies. And so with this theory of handicapped babies unable to reproduce, you can easily understand how a mother of fertile babies could eventually evolve into a queen that gives birth to sterile workers. It's just that those babies that are unfunctional, they have an evolutionary advantage in spreading the genes, not of themselves because they can't, but of their mother. And that's how you get a queen sterile worker system. It's not unlikely. It's a feature of evolution. And if we've seen it happen in the case of insects, why couldn't it happen for the case of human bodies? In fact, what leads to the existence of a body, of a human body, is still a single cell, the zygote. And so what's most likely happening is that the rest of our bodies are like the sterile workers of the ant colony. They have been given birth to. They might have been early in their evolutionary history. These phenotypic cells may have had very little function, but somehow they helped the mother cell produce more babies, make more copies of themselves. And that's how you get multicellular life. Now, I think I'm approaching the end of my time. How much time do I have left?
1:15.
All right, so for body plans, I will say simply, body plans do not relate to the moral arena argument because you could have had a moral arena without having body plans. I mean, we could be blobs just moving like slimy green creatures, advancing without directions, without a back, without a front. Body plans are not necessary to the moral argument, and therefore their inclusion into the probability calculation is erroneous. As far as consciousness, in fact, so Jonathan makes a philosophical zombie type of argument where we could have had the same evolutionary history without conscience. And I agree that consciousness is not necessary. However, I will point out we still have a moral arena even if we don't have consciousness. We could be speaking to each other about proper behavior. We could be correcting each other with signals. We could be punishing each other and encouraging each other in certain directions without feeling, without having qualia. Now, why does consciousness evolve? It's a big mystery. It's a big mystery how consciousness evolves, but I don't think that it is necessary for moral decision making. It could be involved. We're just one of the life forms that happens to have it. So in conclusion, I am not satisfied that Jonathan has met the standard to convince me that 0.1% at each of these steps is the probability. In fact, I think these things are much more likely.
Thank you very much, JF. We will now move into the rebuttal phase. So for this, it's just going to be a quick 10 minutes from each speaker, followed by our cross-examination. So I am setting the timer for 10 minutes. And by the way, somebody asked for JF's book link. Sorry I didn't think of that before, JF. So I had since put JF's book link down in the description. And so let me know if any other links would be useful to you in the audience. Thanks so much for asking. And Jonathan, I have the clock set. I'll start it on your first word.
Well, thanks so much for your engaging presentation. Thank you for engaging with my arguments. You started by saying, suppose I was to see a squirrel scratching itself, what is the likelihood of that? And you can make the same argument with that. And so you were saying that you can parody the argument in that way. No, I don't think that a squirrel scratching itself is something which is something that intuitively is something that God would plausibly do, or plausibly bring about, plausibly create. With the argument that I presented in regards to the moral arena is that a moral arena, that is a community of sentient creatures that participate, engage in what we call moral decision making, that is something that God would plausibly bring about. You also said that you could change God to other entities, and the argument would still could still be run, but I don't think that's the case. How would you argue that? I'm not sure. You said there's no sign of conscious agency in the making of life. I beg to differ with that. I mean, life is chock full of digitally encoded biological information. Along the sugar phosphate backbone of the DNA molecule, you have chemical subunits known as bases, which we represent with alphabetic characters A, C, G, and T, which function as Francis Crick demonstrated in 1957. They function as alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code. And in every realm of experience, whether it be when we read a newspaper headline or encounter a hieroglyphic inscription or digitally encoded information in the form of a computer programming script, in all these realms of experience, there's a habitual association between information and conscious activity. And so when you find information intrinsic to the hereditary molecules of DNA and RNA, I think the best explanation is that it too arose by virtue of intelligent agency. This is based on the historical abductive method of scientific inquiry, the method of multiple competing hypotheses, or the inference to the best explanation, that we let our present experience of the cause and effect structure of the world guide our search for the best explanation. And when we're dealing with digitally encoded information and codes and so forth, I think intelligence is the only known cause which can produce that type of effect. Same when we're dealing with systems that require foresight, such as embryonic development or metamorphosis or irreducible complex nanomachines. I think that intelligence, conscious activity is the only known cause of that sort of phenomenon, and so I think it's quite a justified inference. You said you pointed out that we see many of the same sequences of DNA among different organisms. And that is absolutely true. This is an argument based on homology for common ancestry, but I'm not contesting common ancestry in this debate, and it's not relevant, I think, to the question of whether God exists. The question is design or unguided, mindless processes of chance and necessity the best explanation for biological complexity and design? So I'm not contesting common ancestry in this debate. He pointed out a few times that evolution is not a random process, and with this I completely agree. That evolution has random genetic mutations that are acted on by non-random natural selection. I don't have a problem with that. However, when we're dealing with irreducibly complex systems, that you need to have something that works before you have something to select, and so to acquire those irreducibly complex systems, you need a random search to stumble upon them. The same goes for the stable and functional protein structures. Natural selection cannot act on a protein that does not work, does not function. So you need a random search to acquire those functions. And I would argue that biological functions are often separated by discontinuous jumps in complexity, which cannot be scaled by a random search. And so I think that my critique there carries sway. And I was pleased to hear that my opponent agrees with my point about the rarity of proteins and the probability of acquiring new protein folds by chance. And of course, when you're dealing with the origins of life, you don't have natural selection. You need natural selection natural selection can only operate once you've got a self-replicating molecule. You can invoke it to explain the origins of the self-replicating molecule without presupposing the very thing you're trying to explain. So there's various problems with my opponent's argumentation this evening. He talked about the fine-tuning argument, and he said that you cannot apply Bayesian analysis without knowing probabilities. So I give some estimates from the scientific literature on probabilities of attaining the initial constants and parameters and values of our universe, and then argued that in fact, or for the purpose of argument, I even granted that it's not as improbable as we think, and maybe the probability is only 0.1%. That's all I need for the purpose of this argument. So I was deliberately bending over backwards to be as generous and charitable as possible in my estimate of probabilities for the purpose of this calculation. He mentioned that unlikely events happen all the time. He gave the illustration of the casino, and that any deck of cards is equally improbable as any other. He mentioned that any sets of constants is equally unlikely as any other. Well, this is true, but the point is that that the probability of a life-permitting universe is far greater on theism than on atheism. So it's something that you would expect on theism that is at least something that you would expect God to plausibly do or create, whereas the probability on atheism is very, very low. And so there's something special about a life-permitting universe relative to a non-life-permitting universe. Another way of framing the argument would be in terms of specified complexity, that it's not only highly improbable, but also conforms to some independently given pattern, a specification. And as Bill Dembski, a mathematician and philosopher, has argued in his book, The Design Inference, two criteria, namely complexity and specification, are required to be met to warrant a design inference. So it's not merely the improbability, but also the specification that justifies and warrants a design inference. He mentioned that we don't know at this point how many universes there are. Sure, but there's a number of problems with the multiverse theory. I'm happy to get into it later in more detail if you want. There's the Boltzmann brain problem, which I'm sure my opponent's familiar with, that it's far more probable that you would get a single observer fluctuating into existence out of the quantum vacuum than you would get a complex universe occupied by numerous billions of observers, such as we find ourselves in. There's the fact that we presuppose, of course, the argument from the multiverse presupposes that all the universes have different constants which cover combinatorial space, and there's no reason to think that necessarily the case. So it's not just simply having multiple universes that's important, but also a certain type of multiverse that is relevant here. Also, another thing to consider is that these universes have to be based fundamentally on the same physics, otherwise they're irrelevant to the probabilistic resources with respect to our universe. So there's other things we could talk about there in regards to the multiverse, but I don't think that the multiverse really militates strongly against the argument. But it's certainly the only escape hatch that the atheist has to run down at this point, I think. He mentioned irreducible complexity, and
it's a little bit hard to hear you, Jonathan.
I'm sorry.
That's right.
He mentioned the bacterial flagellum and the type 3 secretion system as a homologue of the bacterial flagellum, which I completely agree with. That the type 3 secretion system is a homologue with the bacterial flagellum. However, the bulk of the evidence suggests that the... by the way, just how much time do I have left at this point?
You got 1 minute and 28 seconds.
Okay. So the numerous lines of evidence independently establish that the flagellum actually predates the type 3 secretion system. The type 3 secretion system seems to be an evolutionary byproduct or degradation product of the flagellar system. For example, the type 3 secretion system is taxonomically restricted to a small subset of gram-negative bacteria. Gram-negative bacteria are bacteria which have a double membrane, whereas gram-positive bacteria have only a single membrane. Whereas the flagella are much more widely distributed, so that suggests that the flagellum actually came first. Also, the selection for motility precedes the selection for virulence. You have to be able to inject toxins into multicellular organisms. You have to be able to swim through liquid before there's a selection for injection of toxins into multicellular organisms. Furthermore, bacteria that have type 3 secretion systems, such as Yersinia, possess the genes for making flagella, even if no flagella are assembled, which again is consistent with that hypothesis I suggested. Furthermore, type 3 secretion system genes are commonly found in large virulence plasmids. Flagella genes are split into 14 or so operons, or not found in plasmids. And also, when type 3 secretion system genes are found in the chromosomes of bacteria, their GC content is typically lower than the GC content of the surrounding genome, again suggesting foreign origin. So I think I'll leave it at that and turn over to my opponent.
You got it. Thanks so much, Jonathan. And now we will go to JF's rebuttal. So resetting the clock for 10 minutes. And JF, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, I will be commenting on some of what was mentioned here. So the idea of information being a sign of consciousness. My book essentially provides the argument for how exactly information systems can evolve, specifically information systems for genetic codes and how the different layers of the genetic code can evolve. And the argument goes as follows. It's that replicators sometimes can have an advantage in storing their own information in some other molecules. Imagine you're a replicator, but you're in an environment where you are subjected to very high levels of mutation. Perhaps your genes are not very stable in that environment. The molecule is not solid enough. It can be in the advantage of a life form to be storing itself elsewhere for a moment and then producing its babies later by trusting this molecule. A little bit like we would be doing if you were to take your genes, store them in a hard drive, and then hope that someone will create babies from you 1,000 years from now. We haven't done this in human societies, but we may very well converge toward this. I'm personally against it, but we may very well use the technologies of today to do it. And essentially what happened 4 billion years ago when there was a progression from a protein replicator to an RNA replicator up to a DNA replicator is exactly this. It's a series of life forms that have found an interest in storing themselves through a different media. So as far as the link between information systems and consciousness, it may be a case that in human societies, wherever there are human words, there is often consciousness involved, but it is certainly not the only possibility, and there's no reason to believe that because we see an information system in the cell, that it has to come from some sort of engineer. Also, Jonathan has mentioned the idea of foresight. It is fascinating, and he mentioned the case of the embryo developing. It is a fascinating system, the development of the embryo, that seems to involve so much coordination. There are molecules that are spread along the spinal cord, for example. They will indicate to your body which side is the dorsal side, which side is the ventral side. They will arrange all of the alignments of your organs and limbs. And really, we are developing that way because of these signaling molecules. But evolution and natural selection, the theory of evolution as a whole, actually, shows us that you don't need foresight to establish this. You have the foresight of natural selection, which is not true foresight, but it is a form of foresight in the sense that the adult reproduces later in life. And really, the criteria by which natural selection judges the satisfaction of its axioms, if you will, is at the moment of reproduction. And because the adult has reached some level before reproducing, some level of development, everything in its past history that led to this success is included into natural selection, into the algorithm. In other words, you will not evolve to have adults that did not have a good embryonic development simply because everything you do up to the moment of reproduction is potentially helping you make babies or deranging or keeping you from making babies. And so whatever events, physical events, molecular events, incompatibility of genes you may have, all of this is subject to natural selection, and that's why we have functional life forms today. It's that all of these life forms have been the successful descendants of lines of ancestry that date back 4 billion years, 4 billion years of reproductive success. That's why diseases, disorders, and embryonic development went wrong is a rare observation, relatively. Jonathan mentioned that there were jumps in complexity in life, and that these jumps in complexity could not seem to be explained satisfactorily by a random search. Now, it's important to understand that the process of random mutation is just one of the processes in the modern understanding of the theory of evolution. A lot of the pieces of DNA that lead to very functional proteins in your body are actually not just random sequence of DNA that just got randomly altered one by one. What often happens is that big bouts of DNA can be transferred. And it can happen during crossover, for example, during sexual selection, a piece of chromosome getting exchanged for another piece. It can also happen on more random basis between different parts of the genome due to some accidents. And we see that what we would call them as large mutations or large segment mutations, they happen in bacteria, they happen in sexual life forms too, where a segment of 10 base pair or 100 base pair will suddenly appear or be copied from a different place of the genome and put in that place. We also have phenomena like repeated sequences. We have phenomena of viral transmission of certain segments of DNA. So the idea that random search does not explain jumps in complexity, I would say it's a viable hypothesis, but we have other explanations for big jumps in complexity. Some of them may involve the reuse of certain segments of DNA. For example, look at how it is extremely often that we see protein structures that we refer to as alpha spirals or beta planes, I believe. I'm using it. I'm trying to translate it from French quickly, but essentially we have repeated structures in many proteins that are not even evolutionarily linked to each other every time. And this shows that there is a phenomenon such as convergence toward functional modes. And it also probably in many cases suggests that a protein with a certain segment can accidentally make a copy of its genes. The genes that are underlying the production of this protein can partly replicate themselves within the genome and be reused elsewhere in other ways, in completely different ways. So in that case, you explain the jump in complexity by simply invoking the fact that functional parts of one protein can ease the production of novel other proteins. Jonathan said, when you have the origins of life, you don't have natural selection, which is absolutely true. As long as you have not reached the first replicator, you don't have natural selection. But then we should ask ourselves the question, what is the difficulty in getting to the first replicator? And people, they imagine this problem to be more complex than it is. Replicators can exist in very simple forms. Even an icicle, for example, is a replicator in the sense that the molecules of water are adding themselves to one another and constructing a longer and longer icicle. So the idea of replication is not foreign to nature, and it can happen at very small scales. All you really need is a first strand of protein that does some form of copying, even if imperfect, and then you got life, you got the origin problem solved, and then you can use natural selection to understand the rest. Jonathan said that probability on theism is high, when probability on atheism is low. I denied this claim on many bases, but most importantly, the problem of the theistic explanation is that it invokes a conscious being out there, but it doesn't seek to explain how this conscious being came to be. If we were to try to understand how did God get to where he is, did he have squirrel ancestors?
1 minute left.
Did he have 1 minute left?
Yep.
Did he have bacterial ancestors? Did he have DNA genes? Of course, we would find ourselves with a higher complexity to explain, because not only should we be stuck with explaining how did I got to be who I am, and I'm so glad to hear that Jonathan does not deny common ancestry and evolution, but then how did God get to be where he is? And if he has consciousness, how did we get there? That's a supplemental level of complexity, and you should take all of the percentage of Jonathan and invert them on him and say, Jonathan, why do you claim that it's more likely on atheism when in fact your explanation involves the creation of another being that we've never observed? I think that will be it for, quickly on the flagellar question. I'm not totally foreign to the idea. I'm not opposed to the hypothesis that the flagella could have evolved first and then could have given birth to other parts. I think it's a viable hypothesis. I have no strong position on it.
Thank you very much, JF and Jonathan. I gave JF just a little bit of a bumper, so Jonathan, I can give you like an extra 20 seconds on your closing if you'd like. With that, we'll move into the cross exams, which is a blast. This is my favorite part, folks. This is get to that more of that interaction. And a lot of times people, they're like, yeah, I want the more of the direct contact. So with that, I will set the timer for 6 minutes. So each speaker will get to interrogate the other person for 6 minutes. And Jonathan will start first, given that he is in the affirmative. So Jonathan, I will start the clock on your first word.
You said 6 minutes, right?
That's right.
Well, thank you for that. You said that there's no reason to think that because we see an information system in the cell that it came from an engineer or designing intelligence. Would you not say that information content, especially in digital form, in all of our experience, habitually is associated with conscious activity or design?
Well, the thing is, everything we've done on this planet has changed this planet so much that you could always come back to some human being having produced some informational system, but it is simply logically untrue from a pure theoretical perspective to be saying that only conscious beings can lead to information systems. In fact, there are information systems in bacteria, exchanging of signals existing between different cells, and there is no reason to believe that it comes from consciousness.
I agree that there's information systems in bacteria, but I'm arguing that that is best explained by design.
Well, my point is you can have communication between different agents, and in the case of bacteria, I don't think that they are conscious. So you can imagine a separate consciousness outside of the universe to try to explain it, but personally, I have no difficulty believing that evolution forces can lead, natural selection can lead to effective communication systems between a sender and a receiver without or with consciousness.
Well, I completely agree that bacterial cells communicate with each other. You're referring, I'm sure, to the phenomenon of quorum sensing, which is the regulation of gene expression in response to fluctuations in the density of the cell population. And bacteria can produce and release signal molecules known as autoinduced.
So sorry, bud.
Yeah,
I think we lost like the last 10 seconds. The audio at least didn't come through for me.
Okay. I'm sure that you're referring to quorum sensing, which is basically the regulation of gene expression in bacteria in response to changes in the density of the cell population. So bacterial cells can produce and release chemical signaling molecules known as autoinducers that increase concentration as a function of cell density. That's not the sort of information I'm talking about. I'm talking about complex and specified information. That is information that's not only highly improbable given the available probabilistic resources, but also it's specified and highly irregular. So I don't think that is
Well, on that, I would say there is no upper bound on the complexity that a naturally selected system can reach. And to me, we are in demonstration of this. I'm sure you would disagree interpretationally, but there is no sign that natural selection stops at a certain degree of complexity. And visibly, to me, and since you believe in common ancestry and evolution, I would argue also in your position, human beings have evolved toward complex communicational systems of very high informational content, the alphabet, the English language, anything that we use to communicate. And there's no sign that natural selection cannot lead to this. In fact, natural selection will lead to this as long as the speaker has an interest in transmitting information for his own reproduction or the reproduction of his kin, and as long as the receiver of the speech also has interest in understanding that information.
Leaving aside the origins of conscious communicators, whether evolution can explain that or not, nonetheless, information comes from conscious communicators. And when we find information in the cell, I think information is the sort of phenomenon that requires foresight, and we instinctively recognize this. If you look at a cliff face, you don't see a pattern that indicates design, you just see a random conformation. Whereas if you were to go to Mount Rushmore in South Dakota and see the faces of 4 U.S. presidents carved into the cliff face, you instantly infer intelligence. The same is true on the sandy beach, and when you see, John loves Mary etched into the sand, we instantly infer intelligence. So information always finds its source, in all of our experience, with an intelligent cause. Would you not agree?
Information, no, because I have a broader sense of what information is. What I would simply say is, I think my view is inverted with respect to yours, where I can recognize the possibility that we could have human language without having the kind of intelligence we have. I kind of view a possible set of cognitive beings that we could have been, and some of them may not feel, some of them may not have the kind of IQ we have, and some of them may not even have foresight or intent, or experience intent in any way. So to me, communication can exist, it can evolve, it can be complex. As far as what we are high IQ creature with some intelligence, with some planning capacities and conscious ones. That's just who we are, and it just turned out that for our evolutionary history, it must have been better than not having consciousness. And the reasons, at least the hypotheses on this, are very satisfying to me. We needed to display emotional triggers so that our parents would care about us. We needed to be complex enough in the emotional sphere to be selected by a sexual partner. And we see in the modern behavior of humans a lot of signs that this is what happened, that we got selected to be emotional, intentional creatures.
Time. I'm sorry, Jonathan. Unfortunately, we ran out of this. We went a little bit over the 6 minutes.
Well, I think it would be fair to give him the time to respond to this because it was important.
Okay.
Well, you can ask me in your cross-examination.
Yeah.
You bet. So we will move to the cross-exam with JF interrogating Jonathan, and I will start the clock on your first word, JF.
All right. So on the question of consciousness, and well, I'd like to ask you first, what's your view on the possibility of evolving consciousness? Do you think it's out of the question from natural selection?
Yes, I would tend to think so.
And why?
I do think that use consciousness. To be honest, consciousness and neuroscience isn't something I've done a huge amount of reading on, but it just seems intuitively improbable. But it's not something I've researched in great detail.
Now, the way I see it is consciousness is potentially explained by natural selection to the extent it helps us make babies. So do you see in the modern behavior of female selection of males, for example, in the dating system, don't you see there a sign that, oh yes, some emotions, some types of male behavior are more attractive, and those relate to consciousness, to ability to demonstrate emotionality, etc.?
Well, there's plenty of things in biological evolution which are advantageous to the organism, but that doesn't mean that it can be produced by a random search that can be selected by natural selection. So, I mean, if I was, I mean, human flight would be advantageous, but that doesn't mean that natural selection is likely to access that.
So suppose that I say there was acts of communication between offspring and mothers demanding for milk, for example. The act of communication, you don't have a problem that it can evolve, but why would you have a problem then that the emotion in the baby's brain, that the qualia or the consciousness aspect of it would be not likely to evolve?
I don't understand. You point out that there's a selective advantage to consciousness, but how does that relate to the evolvability of consciousness?
Well, the thing is, you seem to be denying the likelihood that consciousness evolves. What I'm trying to get to is the acts of communication within human society. It seems that you don't have a problem that they could evolve. A baby crying for milk, for example, would you say that this can evolve?
A baby crying for milk. Sure.
Now, my point is, if the baby was to then evolve to have emotions that made him cry in a way that is more convincing to the mother, to experience some sort of internal signal about how much he needs that milk, wouldn't you say that could evolve just like the original act of communication evolved?
I don't know, possibly, but I don't see how it's relevant to the origins of sentience.
Well, it is just to understand how you can deny the likelihood of sentience not evolving, as opposed to anything else. In fact, you mentioned flying in humans. I think that on that, humans do fly. And in terms of consciousness, they do experience consciousness. And so I have no difficulty in imagining situations where consciousness would evolve.
Okay. I do.
All right. All right. Then perhaps we can talk about what you said about embryonic development. Do you recognize that because of natural selection, because in nature it is an accounting system that works at the baby production moment, if you will, at the reproductive moment, that effectively it tests for your success since your entire life, since you were a zygote, and therefore natural selection can explain the current state of embryonic development in mammals.
No, this is similar to the argument you just gave with respect to consciousness, and it's equally bad.
Why is that?
Because you're pointing to a selective advantage that a viable reproducing organism provides an advantage, but you haven't shown that a random search can put together a developmental pathway leading to the viable adult form is capable of reproduction. And that's the question that we want to address.
All right.
There's no question that once you have it, then natural selection can act on it. It's getting it in the first place that's the problem.
Yeah, but when we see different life forms, down to shrimps, we see common structures in the way embryos develop. And this is telling me that we see the traces of this random search in the sense that a worm will have certain events of segmentation, which insects will share, which eventually vertebrates will share. And so we see that there is a path from a worm to a human that could explain the increased complexity of embryonic development, and where the random search doesn't seem to be a problem given that it has happened over billions of years.
I still don't understand your point.
My point is that embryonic development is well explained by natural selection, and that what we observe in terms of the complexity of embryonic development does not involve foresight as you suggest it to be.
Yeah, I know that's what you're saying, but I don't understand how your arguments until that conclusion.
All right. Then I will let the audience judge on this, and perhaps, I don't know, how much time do we have left?
You've got 7 seconds.
All right, well then let's go for the concluding statements.
You bet. So we'll wrap up with 5-minute closings, and Jonathan, I will start the clock for your closing on your first word.
Well, thank you, JF, for participating in the debate. I was as you might recall in my opening statements, that I presented the moral arena argument for the existence of God. I argued that the probability for moral arena existing on theism is significantly higher than on atheism, and I gave a number of factors relevant to the calculation for the probability on atheism, and I bent over backwards really to assume the most generous of probabilities at each stage. I assumed a very highly generous prior probability of theism, and I assumed a very generous probability of each of the factors that I considered, and as we saw, the evidence for theism, the cumulative evidence for theism from these factors is very, very powerful, very, very strong, very, very compelling. And I thought my opponent's arguments this evening were extremely weak. He seemed to misunderstand evolutionary biology at a very profound level. He, on numerous occasions, seemed to think that because some factor is advantageous to the organism, and provides some selective advantage, that therefore it's accessible by random mutation and natural selection, and it just simply doesn't follow. And so I was a bit confused as to why he thought that was a valid way of demonstrating that. His critiques of the fine-tuning argument were also very weak. As I mentioned in my rebuttal, he gave the casino analogy and pointed out that unlikely events happen all the time, that any sets of constants equally unlikely as any other. And I think this argument is fallacious because, to take an illustration, imagine a casino analogy and we're playing poker and I'm Delta Royal flush 30 rounds in a row. And people start to get suspicious thinking I'm cheating, and I say, well, this is just as improbable as any other set of hands. Well, no, it's a special hand, and so it's relevant to the design inference. He talked about the origins of the first self-replicators. He says that he agreed with me that natural selection doesn't work until you have the origins of the first replicators, but then he said that replicators can exist in very simple forms, even an icicle. But yes, an icicle isn't an organism. Icicles aren't subject to natural selection. They don't have populations. So again, a very weak argument that seemed to just fundamentally misunderstand the whole evolutionary synthesis. He said that he mentioned that I claimed that the probability on theism of a moral arena is high, whereas on atheism is low. That's not actually what I said. I said that the probability on theism is higher than that on atheism. I even gave the probability on theism as 1%, which is a low probability. But nonetheless, even a probability that low is still much, much higher than the probability on atheism. So that was the gist of the argument. He said the complexity of God is even higher than the complex things in the universe, and I didn't seek to explain how this conscious being or God came into being. This is kind of Richard Dawkins' central argument in his book, The God Delusion, which is a bad argument, and this is why. In order to posit an explanation as the best explanation for a phenomenon does not require you to have an explanation of said explanation. Otherwise, you would lead to an infinite regress of causal explanations, and nothing ultimately would be explained. So, again, that's one reason. Another reason is that God is a necessary being. He's essential. He's not contingent. The universe is contingent. God is necessary, non-contingent. Every worldview must ultimately come back to an unmoved mover, something which didn't begin to exist, isn't contingent on something else for its existence, and just exists as a brute fact. And the universe certainly isn't it, because the universe began to exist. And I would contend that God is the best explanation for the unmoved mover, that which exists out of necessity. So he mentioned that and also one other point on that is that God, the proposition of God is not a complex hypothesis. Actually, God is simple because God isn't comprised of parts. So it's to say that an immaterial being is more complex. And he said that he has no strong position on the flagellum being before or after the type 3 secretion system, but his argument assumed that the type 3 secretion system came first. And so with that, I think that we should conclude the motion, indeed, that the evidence is very, very powerful for the existence of God.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. We will next move into the closing from JF. So, also, reminder, if you have questions, you can put them into the live chat. I will fish them out, and you can put in @modernday at the start. That'll just make it a little bit easier for me to see them. And last thing, too, if you are enjoying this, which if you're here, you must be, and we hope you are, feel free to hit that like button, as that just helps the button, or helps the channel. That's kind of the most direct way that you can help us out. And so we appreciate you being here. JF, I've got the clock set for 5 minutes, and I will start it on your first word.
All right. Well, I've expressed most of my ideas, so this might be a short conclusion. But I think that someone on the regular chat, Drew Nichols, brings exactly what I would conclude with. He says, how are you constructing a probability for God with no denominator? How? And this is the ultimate weakness in the arguments that we've heard tonight from Jonathan. And you have to be careful when you develop belief to be talking to people and hearing from people who have a claim of knowledge. And a claim of knowledge in the probabilistic sphere cannot exist if there's no denominator. You cannot claim 0.1 or whatever number you want for the probabilities of the universe if you don't know how many universes there are. And Jonathan has acknowledged, we don't know. There are problems with the multiverse. We don't know anything. But you cannot claim probabilities when you have only one observation, which is ours. And this undermines the entirety of the different steps that he has shown us. Okay, we are a moral creature. We are descending from creatures with body plans. We are descending from creatures that had to evolve first. That's who we are. And you won't have any sort of probabilistic calculation that is serious in any way until you have 10 billion planets observed with exactly how many of these planets contain life, how many of these life forms became multicellular or something of the kind. What we're left with is that we are who we are. It's very special, it's very complex, but it's not hard to explain with systems of evolution, with theories that emerge from biology, and therefore there's no need to invoke both probabilities and the existence of agents outside of our observable reach. That is my conclusion for tonight.
Thank you very much, JF. Next, we will move into the open question and answer. So we are going to move through these as fast as I can because it bothers me as well when we don't get through all of them. So we're going to shoot for it. And for this, we had a limit of 20 minutes. And I'm sorry to say that, just to respect our debaters' time, and frankly, I actually have to help a friend move. So I gotta, we really do have to have it only be 20 minutes. I'm sorry about that, but we'll go quick. Summer's, let's see. Oh no, who is this? We'll go back to this one. Sarah Slaps chat. Thanks for your super chat. She says, for Jonathan, some flagella are seen to just secrete proteins other than flagellar components. Doesn't that mean that the ancestor was probably just a simple secretion system that got complex?
I assume he means the type 3 export system. The type 3
a little bit hard to hear you, Jonathan. I'm sorry.
In the flagellar system, the type 3 export system exports flagellar proteins outside the membrane, the fly C flagellum subunits, the flagellum monomers, which perform the propeller. Whereas in some organisms like Yersinia pestis, they don't produce, which is a causal agent of bubonic plague, they don't produce flagellum. They don't produce a flagellum, but they do secrete yacht proteins, Yersinia edger proteins, which are virulence factors. But for the reasons I gave earlier, there's ample reason to think that the flagellum came first, and the type 3 secretion system is an evolutionary byproduct or degradation product of the flagellar system. And even if it was the other way around, simply that you have the type 3 secretion system as an island of function on the way to getting the flagellum doesn't mean that you can evolve a flagellum by natural selection evolution. Bill Dembski gave an analogy of it being like saying that you could go from you could go from Los Angeles to Tokyo on foot because you discovered the Hawaiian Islands. So it's you still have a lot of steps that you need to do, and you need to put together the assembly apparatus of the flagellum, which is highly choreographed for timely development. You don't want to produce the flagellar propeller before you've put together the hook basal body apparatus that anchors it in the cell membrane, etc. So there's a whole elaborate mechanism of choreography and assembly regulation for putting this thing together, and I think it's beyond the reach of a blind, unguided process.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. And I'm open to, like, if the speakers want to give a quick response, you guys can, but hopefully if you're just dying to, if the opposing speaker wants to give a quick rebuttal, just because we want to get through as many as possible. Drew Nichols, thanks for your super chat. Drew said, squirrel scratching its testicles. I already knew this was a great channel. This is the proof. Well, that's very nice, Drew. So it's definitely a creative example. So Sarah's Labs chat, thanks for your super chat. Second super chat, she had said, it is accepted that cyanobacteria are, and then in parentheses, our oldest bacterial fossils, caused the oxygenation of the atmosphere and they lack flagella. Does this suggest to you that the flagellum evolved?
Not all bacteria have flagella, so no one's ever said that all bacteria have flagella, so I don't understand the argument.
Gotcha. We can, Sarah, if you clarify it in the live chat, I'll keep an eye open. I can add anything onto it. Steven Steen, thanks for your super chat. These are always awkward. He says, does God exist? James's existence proves God loves us. That's very sweet. I appreciate that, Stephen. He's a troll, right? Next one up, thanks for your question, Mr. Pluto the dog. He said, which God are we talking about? I don't know if that was for me. I think that was maybe for me at the very start of the debate. It was just a God in general. So, Slam RN, thanks for your question. She said, for Mcclatchy, I am curious if you accept Dr. Joshua Swamitdas's reason for why he reviewed Darwin Devolves in Science magazine, quote, the end of evolution, quote, end quote, the way that he did.
Yeah, I've read the article. I was very disappointed with it. It was a bit of a train wreck of a review. Made a lot of very fundamental errors, which I don't have time to get into in depth here, but they're reviewed in detail at Evolution News and Science Today. You can find it at evolutionnews.org. In fact, if you go to the website of Darwin Devolves, it might be darwindevolves.com or something like that, you can find the links to the responses there, I think, as well.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. And what I might do, just so that JF gets plenty of action during the question and answer as well, is if I might start bumping some of the questions for JF up so that it's not all for Jonathan. They're firing at you, Jonathan. Let's see. So we do have... Wow, I don't think we... We do have one for JF. Thanks, Slam RN. Thanks so much for your question. She had asked, what year is JF's paper on type 3 secretory systems and flagellum? I thought that has been shown to be wrong, as that secretory is younger than flagellum genes.
It's in the volume Gene and Protein Evolution in 2007, volume 3, page 30 to 47.
Thank you very much. And then Slam RN, another question. This is for Jonathan. When will your doctorate be formally recognized?
I don't know. It's the answer to that.
Gotcha.
Very soon. I'm just at the revision stage.
You bet. And then thanks for that. Slam RN. Oh, we got that one. Canderman, thanks for your question. He said, is it consistent with a theist's logic to conclude that anything with a low enough probability happening must have been coordinated by a god? Can you hear me?
Sorry, was it to me?
Oh, it was for Jonathan. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yep. The Candor Man asked, is it consistent with the theist logic to conclude that anything with a low enough probability happening must have been coordinated by a god?
No, absolutely not. There's many improbable events which I don't think are designed. If you flip a coin 100 times, you've got an improbable sequence of coin tosses. I mean, any sequence, or if you throw a dice 100 times, any sequence you get is very improbable. So it's not merely the improbability. Bill Dembski, in his book The Design Inference, postulated that the method by which we infer and detect design in nature is specified complexity. That is, that we have two criteria, both of which need to be met. One is complexity, that is improbable to the extent that it exhausts the available probabilistic resources. The other being specification or conformity to some independently given pattern. So simply something being probable isn't a reason to infer design.
Gotcha. Next up, let's see. Tyler Durden, thanks for your question. They had asked for John. He says, we have squirrels scratching their testicles right now. If God wouldn't create those and we have them right now, did you just admit there is no God?
I don't understand what you're saying there.
That's because earlier, Jonathan, and I noted this, Jonathan said, I don't think God would create squirrels that scratch their balls, but I think you were saying that in jest. I don't think you meant it as a purely logical truth.
I didn't say that. I said that there's no reason to think that that is something which you would expect God to possibly create. That's not.
Okay.
Sort of, when you're, I mean, and when I talk about sentient creatures that form the moral arena, I don't necessarily mean human creatures. I mean sentient creatures that produce a moral arena, which is the sort of thing that you would expect God to create on the hypothesis of classical theism.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. And then we have a quick one from Canderman. He actually wanted to ask both if it's consistent with the theist logic to conclude that anything with a low enough probability happening must have been coordinated by a god.
Well, I already said no.
That was he had asked if both would be willing to respond to it.
Well, I mean, he's asking if it's consistent with the theist logic. I mean, I can't speak for the theist logic. All I would say is that if it was their conclusion, I would call it out as fallacious. But yeah, it's not because something is highly improbable that it comes from an agent.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. And then Tyler Durden, thanks for your next question. He says, how does he, quote-unquote, intuitively determine what a god would or would not create? What is his fact-checking metric for his feeling or intuition that he has about God's tendencies? The only thing is, I'm not sure who this is for, because I think it could the door could swing both ways. Do you guys want to guess who that might be for? They didn't mention.
Oh, that was for Jonathan. It was a follow-up on this previous question.
Okay.
Right. So on the hypothesis of classical theism, which is a god that is maximally good, and then the existence of a moral arena seems to be something which is good and consistent with God's character to create. Notice I did not say in my presentation that it was I did not argue in my presentation that it was probable on theism that God would create a moral arena. I only argued that it's more probable on theism than it is on atheism, and it's something that seems consistent with the God of classical theism that he would bring about. But I only argued that it's less improbable on theism than it is on atheism.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Then we have Monk Mayfair asking the same question that Praise I Am That I Am asked, which is to Jonathan, can you give an external justification that you exist? I think this is Praise that asked it for JF, and then Monk Mayfair is asking it for Jonathan, whether or not you can give an external justification that you exist. So we'll have, if both of you want to answer this. And if you can't, then how can you say that God does or does not exist?
Well, René Descartes famously tackled this question, the mantra, I think, therefore I am. In other words, if I doubt my existence, there has to be someone doing the doubting, so I cannot reasonably deny my existence without it's reductio ad absurdum, because there has to be someone doing the doubting, and so to doubt one's existence presuppose the existence of the doubter. So I know for certain that I exist, but I don't know for certain that anyone else exists. I just know for certain that I exist. Jeff?
I agree, and the question was mentioning an external evidence. Well, external evidence, you would have to have some form of first axiom. You would have to say, I trust others when they report that I exist, or you would have to say, I trust that my actions in the world having an impact is a sufficient demonstration. Of course, if you want to doubt everything, you can, but you need some form of empirical first axiom, which will lead you to conclude that, okay, I'm not being utterly deceived.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. This is fun. I enjoy the classic philosophy. Canderman, thanks for your question. In the case of poker, how many royal flushes would need to be dealt for the probability to be low enough for God to be the explanation? I think that's for Jonathan.
How many hands of poker would I need to play in order for the probability to be low enough to justify belief in God? Is that the question?
How many royal flushes would you need to get in a row to where you would say, wow, that's sufficiently improbable, this must be the result of God?
Well, normally you would conclude cheating. Or someone stacked the deck or something like that. So there would be a design inference, but there wouldn't necessarily be there's no reason to think that God is stacking the deck. Gotcha.
Thanks so much. Midwave, forgive me if I mispronounce it, Midwave Productions, good to see you again. He said, question for JF. He asked, do you believe your response is an effect of rational evaluation or a determined response? If the former, how do you know this is not a determined response?
Well, there's the fallacy, the false dichotomy between rational response and determined response. You can have determined machines that are knowledge-seeking and that are rational. They operate according to some axioms. So my answer to you is yes, my response to you is determined, but I've evolved to be a knowledge-searching machine of some quality, and as such, what I say is not pure bullshit.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Then Black Holes in the Sky asks, for I think it's for both the debaters and the live chat. We've never done one for the live chat. That's an interesting idea. They asked, if a coin is tossed enough times, what are the chances that it will land on its edge? It's an interesting one I haven't heard. So with that, we want to say we had closed the Q&A. I think we've got to have a little bit of time, but we want to say thanks so much to our speakers. It has been an interesting and just intellectual depth-filled type of debate. So we appreciate you guys both being here. As mentioned, just want to remind the audience, their links are in the description. So if you're like, yeah, I want to hear more, well, you can go out and check. As it is, if I remember right, I want to make sure I say the title of your book, your biology book, or I should say biologically oriented book, JF, The Revolutionary Phenotype. That's linked in the description as well. And then Jonathan, the Apologetics Academy, which Jonathan is the founder of, and which has scholars come on pretty much weekly, different PhDs in different fields. That is linked in the description as well. So want to say thanks so much for coming on, everybody. We hope that you keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. And again, I personally owe and thank the debaters for coming on, as they could have gone anywhere, but they were willing to come on to Modern Day Debate for this channel. Thanks for being here, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Take care, everybody.